At the peak of its strength, the Roman Empire looked unstoppable. Its armies marched across continents like a moving wall of steel, defeating kingdoms, taking control of cultures and pulling everything into its expanding world. Almost every decade, the Senate added a new province to its maps. Gaul was taken, Egypt was brought under control, Judea gave in, and even Dio became a name remembered in history. Everything seemed to follow the same expansion plan of an empire that believed its borders could keep growing forever. But there was one exception. In the far north of Britain stood a land unlike the others, a rugged, misty region where mountains rose high, forests stood dark and silent, and the cold winds cut sharply through the air. This land was called Caledonia, known today as Scotland. The question is, what was so different about this place that even the most powerful empire of the ancient world failed to conquer it? That's the story we are going to uncover. The land Rome could never claim. From the very beginning, Rome never looked at war only as a way to defend itself. To the Romans, war was a tool to show strength, gain honor, and spread their way of life. Conquering a land was not just about ruling it. It was about forcing Roman order onto what they saw as chaos. Every new territory was celebrated in Rome as a victory of reason and civilization itself. This mindset was already present during the Republic, but it became much stronger during the Empire. Under Julius Caesar, Gaul was destroyed. Under Octavian, Egypt was annexed, and Hispania was fully brought into the empire. In Asia, even the Parthians, Rome's longtime rivals, were held back within clearly marked borders. And in the West, at what felt like the very edge of the known world, the island of Britannia was swallowed by Roman power. In the year 43 AD, Emperor Claudius began a major campaign in Britain. With the help of local leaders and elites, and backed by Rome's unmatched military force, the south of the island was captured much faster than expected. Some tribes joined Rome willingly, while others were given citizenship and high-ranking positions. Within only a few decades, southern Britain had Roman theaters, paved roads, and even public baths. To the Romans, it looked like another easy victory. But soon their attention moved further north. Caledonia appeared to them as nothing more than another stretch of land to cross, just a tough landscape to push through. They didn't see it as a major challenge, just a practical problem. The people who lived there were dismissed as primitive tribes, without writing, large farms, or organized government. Rome labeled them as savages, people who simply had not yet realized the advantages of Roman rule. Gnaeus Julius Agricola, governor of Britain and father-in-law of the historian Tacitus, was among the first Roman leaders to push campaigns deep into the north. In the biography written by Tacitus, we get a clear picture of how Romans viewed Caledonia. The people there were seen as strong and stubborn, but at the same time backward, meaning, in Roman eyes, they would eventually be defeated. Rome believed that with enough pressure and time, these tribes would submit just like so many others had before. But this confidence blinded them. The empire was skilled at fighting organized armies, making deals with local rulers, and capturing cities. It knew how to cut off food supplies and break down kingdoms. Yet Rome had no plan for an enemy with no king, no capital, and no interest in Roman wealth or citizenship. Once the legions stepped into Caledonia, the campaign began to fall apart. The land itself was the first enemy. Caledonia was a place of stone, water, and silence, built to wear down anyone who entered. Vast plains were broken by steep mountains, narrow valleys, bogs, and forests so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground. The massive Caledonian forest was dark, damp, and dangerous, filled with hidden hazards. Swamps pulled down soldiers, horses, and supply wagons alike. Deep lakes and dark lochs appeared suddenly in the landscape, while the ground remained wet, unstable, and difficult to cross. The weather made things even worse. Rain seemed endless. Fog could rise in seconds and cover everything, and visibility often shrank to just a few steps ahead. Marching legions never knew whether the next path would lead them forward or straight into disaster. Even inside Roman camps, soldiers couldn't escape the climate. Supplies spoiled in the damp air, armor rusted, and illness spread quickly. Roman accounts speak of rising cases of dysentery, chest infections, and strange fevers that weakened the troops. These weren't quick deaths in battle, but slow, exhausting blows to the morale of entire legions. Roman strength relied on discipline and order, marches carefully timed, camps built in perfect lines, secure supply routes, and reliable roads. The army functioned like a machine, but in Caledonia the terrain constantly broke that machine. Roads washed away, supply convoys were trapped or destroyed, and maps were useless because the land shifted with fog, rain, and mud. Scouts often lost their way and entire patrols vanished without explanation. Modern archaeological studies and climate research confirm that Scotland in the Roman period was even harsher than today. Winters were longer, summers were short, and the constant damp weather turned every campaign into less of a fight against the Caledonians and more of a war against nature itself. The Romans came ready to fight armies of men, but in Caledonia, their fiercest enemies were the land itself and the warriors who blended into it. They weren't like the disciplined legions of Rome. They moved through the fog like shadows, bodies painted, faces hidden, eyes sharp and watchful. The Romans called them Picti, the painted ones. This name came not from knowing their culture or language, but from the blue markings on their skin drawn with woad, a local plant that produced a deep blue dye. To the Romans, this was the only visible trace of a people who left no written records and built no great cities. The Picts were not a single nation under one ruler. They were many tribes and clans scattered across mountains, valleys, and forests. Each had its own leader, traditions, and survival methods in one of the toughest landscapes in Europe. Rome mistook this lack of central government as weakness, but in reality, it was one of their greatest strengths. With no single king or capital to overthrow, the Romans had nothing they could strike down to claim victory. Defeating one tribe meant nothing. Others would continue to fight. Their homes were circular stone towers known as brochs, usually built on high ground where they could see danger approaching from a distance. They lived in isolated settlements that were hard to reach and easy to defend. They knew every path, every escape route, and every place where an ambush could be set. On rivers and lakes they moved in light, quiet boats, taking hidden routes that Roman soldiers could not detect, and when pursued they simply vanished into the forests, as though the trees themselves had swallowed them. But what truly set them apart was not just their tactics or weapons. It was their refusal to accept Rome in any form. They did not want Roman citizenship. They did not care for Roman roads, clothing, or language. They rejected everything the empire offered, striking directly at one of Rome's most effective tools, the power to absorb and transform its enemies. Throughout its history, Rome had turned rivals into allies. It won over local elites, gave positions of honor to barbarian leaders, and extended citizenship to the children of foreign kings. This was how the empire spread, by creating Romans outside Rome itself. But the Picts rejected that offer completely. They saw no advantage, no honor, and no reason to join. To them, these hills and valleys were home, and anyone entering with weapons was nothing more than an invader to be destroyed. Tacitus, in describing the Caledonians, the ancestors of the Picts, recorded a phrase that perfectly expressed their way of life. They were more ready for war than for submission. This wasn't just about pride, it was survival. The harder Rome attacked, the more the Pictish tribes scattered. The more Rome built, the more they tore it down. The resistance Rome faced in Caledonia could not be crushed with the usual kind of victories. It didn't come from castles or organized senates. It came from the land itself, the forests, and the simple refusal of the people to kneel. And from that mindset was born a completely different style of warfare. Rome's greatest advantage had always been discipline and order, predictable formations, precise commands, and a steady advance that pressed down on their enemies like a moving wall. This worked when opponents showed up in open battlefields, but the Picts didn't. They refused to fight on Roman terms. Instead, they waged a war built on silence and surprise. There were no massive clashes in the open. Instead, ambushes exploded. In the thick forests, night raids struck camps as soldiers slept, and patrols vanished without a trace. The fighting often began just when the Romans thought the road ahead was clear, and ended with arrows cutting through the fog, spears flying from the undergrowth, or rocks crashing down from the hillsides. The legions were not ready for this type of war. Roman soldiers carried heavy loads, shields, swords, armor, rations, and tools, all designed for organized battles. The Picts carried little. They moved fast, struck hard, and disappeared before a counterattack could form. They blended back into the land as if they had never been there. Tacitus described this style of combat when writing about the famous Battle of Mount Gropius. He tells how the Caledonians appeared like shadows on the hills, fought fiercely, and then melted away. Even though Agricola claimed victory and boasted that thousands of enemies had been killed, the outcome was hollow. There was no lasting control, no real conquest. With no capital to seize and no central power to dismantle, survivors simply broke apart, regrouped, and showed up again weeks later in a different place. Fighting them was like trying to strike smoke. Each attack was meant to disrupt the Roman routine. The Picts cut supply lines, intercepted messengers, and kept soldiers in constant fear. The legions slept with their weapons at hand, never sure when the next strike would come. And when the Romans finally managed to respond, their enemies were already gone. Sometimes they left behind only footprints, other times not even that. This grinding war did not wipe out entire legions in a single blow, but it broke something even more important: morale. Rome understood the cost of that. A soldier without rest, short of food, and haunted by constant fear lost his effectiveness. A commander, forced to react to invisible threats, made mistakes. Day after day, the campaign became less about victory and more about survival. And survival was a game the Picts were willing to play for as long as it took. They had no timetable, no cities to defend, no empire to protect. They had only one purpose: to resist. When direct force failed, Rome turned to the method it had used in many other parts of the world: rule through terror. It was an old formula, brutal but effective. The Roman method of breaking resistance was always the same: destroy crops, block resources, take hostages, and burn villages. This approach had worked in Gaul, in Judea, and in Germania. Entire nations had surrendered after watching the legions wipe out their food and homes. But in Caledonia, this tactic collapsed. There were no great cities to burn, no central farms to seize, no warehouses packed with supplies. The Picts lived differently. They survived in small, scattered communities, spread across mountains and valleys. They hunted, fished, and gathered what they needed. And when danger came close, they simply vanished into the land. Their villages could be emptied in hours, leaving nothing behind for Rome to punish or destroy. The empire had always known how to control people by making them hunger. But here, hunger did not work the same way. Even so, the generals tried. They built forts, secured outposts, and attempted to impose control. One of the largest was at Inchtuthil, a massive stronghold in the heart of Caledonia. It was designed to house thousands of soldiers. During excavations, archaeologists uncovered more than 750,000 iron nails buried or discarded, hidden deliberately before the fort was abandoned. The soldiers had left before even finishing the project, ensuring nothing useful would remain for their enemies. This became a repeating pattern. Construction began, temporary occupation followed, and then came abandonment. The campaigns pushed forward, but nothing lasting took root. No Romanized towns appeared, no permanent roads survived, only footprints that the rain quickly erased. The frontier shifted constantly, advancing and retreating like a line drawn in the sand. The further north the legions went, the heavier the cost became. Every soldier needed grain, wine, oil, weapons, and equipment. All of it had to come from the south. But the deeper they marched into Caledonia, the harder and riskier it was to transport those supplies. Roman roads, symbols of the empire's power, were no match for this terrain without enormous expense. Convoys moved slowly, became vulnerable, and were easy targets for ambushes. Roman records mention that reinforcements had to be sent often. Yet even when new troops arrived, the Picts struck again, sometimes in areas Rome had already claimed as pacified. What the empire called peace was, in reality, just a short pause before another raid. Modern historians like Peter Solway and Shepard Frere underline this truth. North of Hadrian's Wall, Rome never truly ruled. Their presence was temporary, fragile, and constantly resisted. Worst of all, it drained the empire's resources, manpower, and morale. That raised the critical question: was this land worth the cost? For Rome, every conquest had to be justified not only by victory, but also by reward. If there was no benefit to outweigh the expense, the logic of empire began to break. War drained resources: food supplies, roads, soldiers' pay, transport of goods, construction of forts, weapons, and endless repairs. All of it demanded money. For any province to remain part of the empire, it had to give something back: metals, slaves, taxes, or some other form of wealth. And this was where Caledonia became Rome's unsolvable problem. Although southern Scotland had deposits of iron, lead, and even small amounts of gold, the land made mining nearly impossible. The rugged hills, constant rain, lack of infrastructure, and the presence of hostile tribes meant that every attempt at extracting resources came with extreme risk. Unlike Gaul or Egypt, there were no established cities, no wealthy elites to win over, and no markets to control. Caledonia had nothing that could repay the heavy investment Rome poured into it. Transport made the problem even worse. The famous Roman roads, symbols of imperial strength, were nearly useless here. The terrain was unstable, broken up by marshes, rivers, and narrow valleys. Straight, secure routes could not be built. The few roads Rome managed to construct were winding, exposed to ambushes, and far too costly to maintain. Not only did this block access to potential resources, it made the simple task of keeping soldiers fed a constant logistical struggle. Building forts in the north consumed enormous effort. Durable stone had to be brought from far away, guarded during the journey, and hauled across unforgiving land. Laborers and soldiers had to be protected while construction was underway. And once the forts were complete, they required constant garrisons. Those troops then demanded steady supplies, creating a cycle of cost without return. Maintaining even a single extended campaign in Caledonia cost hundreds of thousands of pounds, yet it produced almost nothing in return. Not a single Roman-style city thrived there. This imbalance soon reached Rome itself. Sources like the Historia Augusta show that by the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the empire's finances were increasingly strained. Emperors had to justify spending to the Senate, and Caledonia gave them nothing to show for it. When Antoninus Pius ordered the construction of a new barrier farther north, the Antonine Wall, he faced criticism at home. Many believed these northern campaigns were a waste of resources that could have been better invested in richer, more stable provinces. Archaeology confirms this divide. South of Hadrian's Wall, Rome left behind cities, markets, mosaics, and public baths, a full Romanized way of life. To the north, only fragments remain: abandoned forts, broken roads, and isolated traces of a presence that never lasted. The conclusion was unavoidable. Rome never truly conquered Caledonia because, in the end, Caledonia was not worth the cost. And so, in the year 122 AD, the empire made a decision that was both practical and symbolic. It stopped. After decades of campaigns and relentless northern resistance, Emperor Hadrian made a bold decision. He ordered the construction of a wall, not just any barrier, but a colossal fortification stretching over 117 kilometers, from the Irish Sea to the North Sea. This was Hadrian's Wall, the new frontier of the Roman world. It was more than stone, stacked upon stone. It symbolized something Rome almost never admitted: that there was a point where advancing further was no longer worth the cost. With its towers, gates, garrisons, and watchposts, the wall stood as the empire's answer to a difficult question: how far could Rome truly rule? The Historia Augusta records Hadrian's reasoning clearly. The wall was meant to divide the Romans from the barbarians. It was not only a physical boundary but also an ideological one. Beyond it lay a world Rome would no longer seek to conquer, but only to contain. For the first time, the empire accepted a permanent frontier. Rome was no longer endlessly expanding. It was beginning to protect what it already held. But that acceptance proved temporary. Barely 2 decades later, another emperor tried to erase the line Hadrian had drawn. Antoninus Pius, known for his more moderate style of rule, ordered the construction of a new frontier wall, about 160 kilometers north of Hadrian's. Called the Antonine Wall, it was less durable, built mainly from packed turf on a stone base. Even so, it was a bold attempt to push the boundary forward once again, to show that Rome could still expand. The effort failed. Within 20 years, the Antonine Wall was abandoned, and the legions retreated to Hadrian's fortification. What had once been considered temporary now became permanent. The back and forth revealed a hard truth. The desire to conquer remained, but Rome's ability was fading. The empire was shifting, from an engine of conquest to a power forced to defend its limits. By the year 208 AD, nearly a century after Hadrian's Wall was first built, the north remained unconquered. The Picts still crossed the frontier, torching outposts, ambushing patrols, and humiliating Rome at its very border. That year, Emperor Septimius Severus resolved to settle the matter himself. Already elderly and in poor health, he nonetheless took command personally, determined to crush Caledonia once and for all. He brought with him his 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta, and mobilized one of the largest armies ever seen on British soil. Over 50,000 soldiers were assembled, a staggering force given the harsh terrain they were about to face. The strategy was clear: destruction. Severus had no wish to convert, build, or bargain. His sole aim was to wipe out the opposition. The coup, historian Dion Cassius records that he may have declared, whether true or legend yet symbolically powerful, subdue the entire land, kill every resistor. And that was the course he pursued. The Roman legions advanced like an unstoppable storm. They set fire to villages, leveled forests, ruined fields, and carved rough roads across the mountains, some of which archaeologists can still trace today. The campaign forced the Picts into the highlands, driven by a harsh, scorched earth method. But the land itself fought back. Soldiers began to collapse from sickness. The endless damp, the cold, poor rations, and the exhaustion of ceaseless marches across hostile ground drained their strength. Many lives ended not in battle but from fevers, infections, and untreated wounds. Supply lines broke down, food failed. To arrive, reinforcements could not pass, and worst of all, despite all this destruction, the Pictish fighters melted into the mist, only to strike back days later. Severus, already frail, grew ill during the invasion. He died soon after, in the year 211 AD, in the city of Eboracum, now York, without conquering Caledonia. With his death, the will to continue vanished. His sons, divided by rivalry, abandoned the north and marched south. The war closed without honor, without surrender, without triumph. There was no celebration, no conquest, only emptiness. And with that, the last major attempt to dominate Scotland ended. From then on, Rome let go of the dream of ruling the far north. Caledonia was fixed as the land the Roman Empire never mastered. In the end, it became more than empty land beyond the frontier. It stood as a sign, the place where the greatest empire of the ancient world was forced to stop, not for lack of troops, not for lack of bravery, but because they faced a people determined never to be ruled, and who knew how to resist. And now I want your thoughts. Could Rome have ever won Scotland if it had pressed harder? Or was failure certain from the very beginning? Share your answer in the comments, and as always, may Mars guide you in battle.